Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar and demo session today. Glad you could join. In this demonstration, we'll be going over automating data transformations for DevOps teams. My name is Rich Martin, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential, and let's move along. So this is kind of a companion piece to another data transformation webinar we did recently that had focus on the network NetOps side of the house, so to speak. This one is going to be more focused on the DevOps side of the house, or maybe even the net DevOps side of the house. If you have one of those unicorns on your team. But what we want to do is I want to take a lot of the same, because we're talking about the data transformation feature set, and take a lot of the same concepts, but show why this is very, very useful, helpful, gives you some options, a lot of flexibility for DevOps teams. And really, at the end of the day, if this becomes a platform that both the network and the NetOps teams and the DevOps teams can use and to work together to build automations, that's what this is about. Because if anybody has a perspective on what automation is all about, it's the DevOps teams, because they're building automations across different domains, different technologies, different sources of truth. And so hopefully coming out of this, you will know and understand when we say data transformation from an Itential perspective, what that means specifically to us, and how that relates to the things you do on a day-to-day basis, writing code, integrating IT systems and accessing APIs, and how you can leverage this to help you, as you write code to do automations on the DevOps side of the house. We're also going to take a look at how we integrate programs. So the good news here is bring your own programs, bring your own code, how we integrate that into the Itential platform, and then how we can build APIs on top of it. So if your code isn't already, API accessible, that's something when you bring into our platform, we can create for you, and that opens up the ability to use those in automation workflows in our platform. So we go from there to saying, okay, now that we have the ability to integrate systems, bring in my own code, how do we transform data between those integrated systems, sources of truths, IPAM systems and the such, ITSM systems that we have to integrate with, and how do we build transformations so that the data that gets put out by those systems through an API call now is usable for my code, and then ultimately transforming that into a workflow so you can see how everything fits together. And so by way of demonstration, we're going to be building this out step by step. Hopefully, I'll be a good enough tour guide to help explain all of these things. And then hopefully relating it back to, from a DevOps perspective, some of the challenges and burdens that you guys go through. And then at least you can see from the perspective of what Itential has to offer within our platform, giving you some ideas that, hey, this might be something very interesting for us. We do have these challenges and burdens, or how you can utilize this to your advantage if this becomes part of the automation platform and tooling that your organization's using. So we're going to do things like integrate with a source of truth, in this case Netbox. We're going to also have a second, so to speak, source of truth from a user form. I'll show you how to do that. We'll view data along the way. We'll build a data transformation so that we can transform it into an API that's valid for our custom code, our script that we're onboarding. That code's going to make the network change, and then we'll view the whole thing and validate that it all worked end to end, and hopefully bring everything back together. So with that, let me share my screen, and we can continue on. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So where do we start? Well, since this is more DevOps focused, let's start with code, because that's the world that most of you live in. If you're in the DevOps world, tuned in right now or watching this, let's start with code. So the first place I want to take you is a part of our platform called Automation Gateway. Now, Automation Gateway has several functions and features. The one that's probably most important for this discussion, especially for DevOps teams, is the fact that this is where you bring your own code and onboard it into the system. So that could be anything script related. I'm going to show you Python because that's the language that I'm currently writing code in right now, but you might be JavaScript or Java. You can bring any and all of that into our platform, as well as, because this is a network automation platform, We know that a lot of teams are leveraging Ansible, so you can bring those kind of playbooks and all those assets back into the platform too, as well as the ones you see listed here. But let's start here. Let's go to scripts, and I've onboarded. Now, for a moment, just in your imagination, I'm a DevOps person. Now, I don't pretend to be, right? I do know enough code to be super dangerous. I have had a background many years ago in developing, but let's just say for a moment, I'm a network DevOps team member, and I've created some code to make a change. And I'm very proud of this. This is my own creation to create loopback interface on a Cisco iOS device. So we can take a look at this. And when we're looking at is really, this is something that runs on the command line. It takes 4 arguments from the command line, right? An interface name, a description, an IP, and a net mask. The device that that we can make changes on is actually handled by Automation Gateway. But those are the 4 fields that we're focused on. Right. And so I require this data to come from somewhere. So where does that data come from? Well, in this case, because it runs on the command line, it's going to come from whoever's running this Python code to input that. But in the world of automation, that data, especially the IP and the net mask, probably comes from some source of truth. And now I have the opportunity to take this this pretty straightforward code and turn it into something a little bit more by integrating a source of truth into the code. So how would I do that? What are my integration steps? So here are my, my integration steps and comments. First, if I'm, since this is Python, I need to find a package that has support for Netbox, and not just any version of Netbox. It has to be my version of Netbox, because Netbox is going to be the source of truth for IP address, specifically here IP address, but it can do a lot more as well, but for IP addresses. So I need to find that version, and I need to import that package so that I can use it inside of my code, so I can leverage that. Then I have to take a look at the documentation and the examples and figure out how to use this library or package in order to do some straightforward thing like fetch an IP address from Netbox. Also have to set up authentication and things like that. When I get that data back, I'm probably going to have to parse it out into something that's formatted for what I need later in this program, right? And that in itself is really the kind of the general integration steps. But I have to do this for every system that needs to be integrated. So it starts with Netbox, and maybe it's, oh, now we can pull some information about inventory, right, for the other pieces of data that I have in this code from another system. So that means that I need to do another integration here. So I have to go through those first 3 steps. And so I have to repeat this for everything that needs to be integrated. And then I have to continue to iterate and transform that code and use these integrations. And so over time, what started off as like a very simple, straightforward, direct project to build some code to make a network change now has lots and lots of integrations. And DevOps teams are very capable of handling it. That's not the issue. The issue is maintaining it and managing it over time. Because what we've seen happen is perhaps I find a package. There's going to be many packages perhaps for integration to Netbox from Python. So the one I pick has to meet the same version of Netbox that I'm currently running. But over time, we need to upgrade, right? We need to go from Netbox version 2 to Netbox version 3. Is my package, is my plugin, is my library, is my module that we're leveraging going to be updated at the same rate? That could be a problem, right? Now you kind of expand this into multiple dimensions because, like I said, I might have 5 or 6 integrations built into this simple script. And that same problem persists as every one of those gets updated to new versions. It could change the API. It could change out some underlying data structures, which means that I must go in here and make changes to this based off of changes to all of these integrations. And that can happen at different times. That could happen at in different ways. And so now this is almost a snowball effect. You can spend a lot of time just updating this. And now if at a point where this is working, we start to leverage the same code. I won't say copy and paste, but it happens a lot. We all know it. If I copy and paste this into not just one program, but a dozen programs, every time something changes with underlying data structures or APIs, somebody has to go in and fix all of that. And that's the issue. That's the burden that when we're talking to customers and we're approaching their DevOps team, they see some of the features that we have that are like very unique to our platform. And they say, hey, can we do something here to help us with this challenge of managing system integrations that seem to happen all the time, or changing data structures, underlying data structures, and kind of decouple that so that we can have a core focus on this code, and that's something you can manage and help us manage in the platform and make it a little easier for us. And again, this is about giving the DevOps teams options, right? It's up to you to develop which integrations you want to put into your code, and which integrations perhaps that you can leverage and manage from Itential. But I want to show you how that can be done. So we start with this. We brought our own code. Here I am, very proud of this, thinking about integration. Instead of integrating Netbox directly into this, let's integrate the Netbox API calls, the integration of the Netbox system, the API calls in Itential, so that all of that, the integration and the data transformation, can just hand off exactly what I need when I need it from the right source in the right format that I need it for my code. And again, I go back to some many years ago thinking the same thing. I've had many projects where I get to write code. You get excited about, yeah, I can't wait to get to like the real core of this, of writing the code to solve this problem. And then you have to mire through all of the libraries you have to import, the data manipulation, especially the data manipulation, just to get to something. And I remember thinking, why is it so hard just to get the data that I want the way I want it? It's almost as if nobody will format it exactly the way I want it. So you have to mire through that. So hopefully this will help be a relatable topic to you, and help you see how this can potentially help your team. All right, so this is our script. So we've taken this code, and now we want to turn it into something that can be called via API, because everything in our automation platform, we take an API-centric, API-first approach, number one, and data structures within our platform, we're leveraging JSON schema and JSON objects for everything. So in order to turn this into something that can be used via an API, we have to decorate it. And so if I click here, for every script that you onboard, you can create, you'll see here is a JSON schema that defines the properties that relate to the argument value, or the arguments on the command line that are part of the script. So you can see we have the four arguments: interface name, description, IP, and net mask, and we're describing the order, because order, at least for this particular script, is important. And so we have that there. And so after that's done and saved, that becomes available. So now this script becomes available within the platform. So good news, bring your own code. We can turn it into an API accessible asset, and now it's available on our platform. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, now how can we help with this challenge of managing integrations, especially as they change over time? So let's take a second stop now and take a look at the Itential automation platform and how we actually integrate into different systems. And so for that, we go to Admin Essentials, where we have the admin functions of the platform. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, we have a couple of things here. Let me show you adapters. So in our demo environment here, if I do a search, you actually see two adapters that are available. So an adapter is an integration that comes from a pre-built library that we provide free of charge to our customers, right? So you can go online, you can download these, you can import them, or you can import them directly from your Itential automation platform. But what we have here is we have our original Netbox adapter, plus we have an updated adapter, right? Netbox 2.11.9. Those exist, and we can run them concurrently. Those are both available in the system, right? But like I just said, those come from a library of pre-built adapters, and those are the ones that are onboarded today, and we'll use one of those too. But what I really want to show you, because that's no different than relying on somebody who's writing a module or a package or a library and utilizing that. We provide that to our customers, but really the power is under integrations, and specifically integration models. So we give you the ability to now take an API spec, Open API, Swagger, or Postman collection, or even if those don't exist, they can be built by hand integrations. But if the standards based API documentation is available, with just downloading that file and importing into our system, we can create an integration from that model to that particular system. And I'll show you what we mean by that. So if I go to import here, and it's going to ask me what I'd like to import. I want to import an integration model. Okay. I've already downloaded a copy of Netbox 3.3, which is a more recent version of Netbox than we are running here internally. And this is the Open API spec. So if I open that, it's going to load it up, and then I can click validate, and it can come back and tell us if this is a valid JSON object based off of the schema. It's valid, and now I can import it. So now you have the opportunity for those IT systems that you're running, even when the versions change. Or another great example is ServiceNow. ServiceNow has several development versions that you can access, and at some point they're going to go from development to production. You can run multiple versions of ServiceNow and start getting those in the system to understand the changes, understand the differences. But the point is, when you integrate a system into our environment, whether it's through an adapter or an integration model, like I just showed you through a file, we have access to all of these APIs that were published in that documentation. So now we can directly call these APIs from our workflow. So this is critical to how we can help DevOps team. Now you're not stranded if versions change and libraries don't. Right? Libraries to access the version of your IT systems. You have direct access to those now, and you can run them concurrently here on in the platform and have access to both of them. And so from here, we could create an integration. For this demonstration, we don't have a version 3.3, but I could create an integration, and that would require me to put the login information, authentication, things like that in. And then that would be live, and all of these API calls would be available within the platform. And so that right there helps to give you some control over your ability to quickly integrate with any of these systems by simply literally dropping a file, an API spec file into the system and building this as you need it. All right, so our next stop, now that we've showed bring your own code, we've showed integrate quickly, data transformation, and also like how we access these API calls, right? And so I'm going to take you to Automation Studio. So this is our drag and drop automation canvas, where we say network engineers, but DevOps teams can utilize this. Again, we want to make it easy to build automations across not just the network, but across all of IT, right? And so you're starting to see these features as well that can help you. So we can create a new workflow here. I'm going to call this DT2 demo. And now, anytime we onboard a system through an adapter or through an integration model into an integration like I just showed you in Admin Essentials, all of that becomes available here. I think of it as a palette, so to speak, where you can drag and drop things as needed. And so if we're going to use Netbox here, all of the API calls that are available become available here. Now, of course, this does require you to understand the API documentation and to do certain functions. Most of our network teams have a IPAM or some sort of source of truth for IP address management. Netbox is one of the more popular ones. And so we are obviously aware of some of the direct calls that are used in order to do that. So if we just want, in its simplest case, if we just want to know how to reserve an IP address, I know that we can do we can leverage this call. I do a search here, I can help narrow that down, and I'll show you this. Post IPAM prefixes ID available IPs. So this comes from the documentation that we used when we onboarded this older adapter or this older version. But the documentation, the description and documentation that exists within the API documentation gets carried over here. we can just summarize this. I will call it request IP address. That'll make it easier. You'll see the adapter ID. So because we have multiple netbox adapters, I can select one of the two that we have onboarded already. And then because this is an API call into a netbox system, it has a well-defined um, requirement for data coming in. So it's asking for an ID and a data. The type is for the ID is numeric. It's a number. The type for the variable data is an object. This is a JSON object. So if you're familiar with Netbox, they use JSON here. So what does that mean? So I can tell you that we want to use ID 63, and for the JSON object, I'll show you this. We're going to pass to it a JSON object with a key of status active and a description webinar. I'm statically assigning the description here just to make it simple. This could be dynamic. This probably needs to be something that's relevant to the IP address of the device you're going to assign, since we're getting a new IP address. But to keep it simple here, I'm going to call it webinar. Now let me show you in Netbox where I reference that information. So if I go into our Netbox instance here, you can create prefixes, pools that we can request IP addresses from, and everyone is numbered as you create them. In this case, 63 is the number here. So IPAM prefix 63, it's going to relate to this pool. So 10.4.1.1/24.0/24. That's where we're pooling from when we request an IP. And the data for the JSON object for status, we want to set it as active when we get that IP address. And then we're going to set the description here. So that's where that comes from. So if I save that, now we can actually just test it to make sure it works. So again, we're using an integrated system and a very specific API call for that system. So if we view this job, so it's going to create an instance of that workflow and run it as a job. It's already completed. That's good, successfully. Let's take a look at the input and the output. So the data coming in, we fed it statically through that pop-up, right? ID 63, which was part of that prefix that we wanted to pull an IP address from. And then we passed keys and values here for status and description. Now the outgoing, so this is the data coming from Netbox. We got the response code, and it looks like it gave us the next available IP, which was 10.4.1.2, which is good. And it also gave us a ton of other information here that we're really not interested in at this time, at least for our particular purposes here. But that's part of parsing data, right? And so that's part of the data transformation piece of it that we'll talk about next. So now let's go back to this and say, okay, so we've got the integration, right? So that's kind of decoupled from our script. We've got the API call, so we can now call directly the APIs. What about the data transformation part? So this is what we'll do here. Make a duplicate tab, and then we will go and create the data transformation process itself. So that's down. Well, you'll see we have existing data transformations, and these are reusable components, and that's a key piece of what we're talking about today. I can create from here a transformation. I'm going to call this DT2 demo transform. Okay, so I mentioned earlier, so now we're in a different canvas, and I mentioned earlier that we take an API-centric approach and we organize, display, and pass data between steps in a workflow, integrations with systems through JSON objects and JSON schema. And so that's what we're doing here with the transformation. I always think of, to simplify it, I think in terms of data in, transform the data, and then send the data out. And that's data coming in that has to match a JSON schema, and data going out, we're going to define the schema for the data out. And in the middle is our transformation process. So since we are taking data that's coming from this API call into the IPAM the netbox system to request an IP address, the data coming out of that becomes the data that we should have coming into the transformation so that we can parse out what we need, in this case, the IP address. So I've copied this data coming out because we can use it to infer the schema that we want from the object that was output. So if I paste it into here, it's going to give us live data from where we just ran that, where it gave us the IP address of .2. However, we can also infer the schema. So now we have a set of rules to validate data coming in, and it should match the data that's coming out from that particular response from Netbox. The only thing here we have to add is a unique identifier. And I will normally do something like this: request IP address, just to give it a nice description. I can save that. Now, as you can see, our incoming schema has now populated based off of that JSON object that we inferred the JSON schema from. So now that's going to match up to the API call and the output of the API call from Netbox. Now we need to figure out, well, what's the data that we need? For this particular case, my script needs an IP address for the loopback, and it needs the next available one. So that should be returned here, and it should be returned in the address field right here. So because this is a string, I can do this. I can map it directly to the outgoing schema, and it's going to, because it's defined as a type string, it's going to match the name and the type for it, and go ahead and give me that as the outgoing schema definition. Now I'm going to modify it a little bit, like to be a little more descriptive. I'm going to call it IP address. Okay. So when we did the inference from the actual JSON object to the schema, it also saved off the data from the object, and we can use that to do some testing, which is a nice convenient thing to do. So if I want to test this, I can run this. This isn't actually executing in a workflow. This is just us testing it. I can generate example inputs. We can manually paste them in here, or I can generate inputs based off of the schema and the data that was used as an example, saved as an example from the object. And if I run this, it's going to give me the output schema. In this case, since there's only one, it's going to tell me that, okay, you've mapped that value from the example, and now you're going to output 10.4.1.2/24. And that's great, except we need to do a little more data transformation, right? I need an IP address without the net mask. And in fact, I need the net mask to be its own variable itself, so that I can pass it to my my awesome create loopback script. So let's do a little more transformation. So we don't need this. What can we do here? That brings us to the methods. Now, I know, especially if you're a JavaScript programmer or a Java programmer, all of these things you can do in code. You're absolutely right. But again, we're talking about decoupling things. And so you can now, within building these transformations, these are reusable across many workflows, and decoupling them and putting them here opens up some possibilities. Here's the cool thing. If you're already familiar with a lot of these methods, this should be a very simple thing. But think about in terms of your colleague in the networking team. This is a source of truth that's very, very relevant to the networking team, right? IP address management. This could be something that they manage and pass to you just the data you need, right? So this opens up a lot of possibilities on how you can leverage these features and tools to not just help you, but help both teams as they progress in this automation journey. And so let's continue here. There's a lot of ways to do that. You know this well as DevOps folks. There's a lot of ways to write code to split this, but what I'll do is a simple split. And if I have any questions, this turns a string into an array of strings. So this is going to output an array. So we can take our let's see, our address as the source, specify it here. We can map it over, and the separator is going to be a slash. Oops, not that, slash, because that should separate the two. And now this is going to return an array. We don't really want an array. We want a string. So we need to take an element of that out of that array. So we can go into here, and we can get the index. So we can now map the array into the source array here and specify index 0. That should be the first element. And now this can output into a string. So let's save that, and now let's test it again. Aha. So that absolutely worked here. And now if we wanted to, we could do another get index. And now I can leverage that same array as a output here as a source into here. Get index 1, which should be our net mask. And now let me create a schema for the net mask. This will just be a type string. Now, if I map that into here, oops, save it, run. Now we can see we're outputting 2 variables defined as outgoing schemas here, IP address and net mask. All right, that's pretty cool. So you can now start to see the functionality here. Now let's pause here and think about this, because this gives us some options. There's a couple things going on here. Number one, the net mask is not the right format for net mask when we're configuring an interface on a Cisco, right? This is a prefix, and we really want a dotted decimal format. So so something like 255, 255, 255, 255, or something similar to that. Now, in our environment, we may have a network policy that loopback interfaces, because remember, we're focused on building the greatest loopback interface creating code that ever existed. And maybe there's a network policy defined by the networking team that says every loopback, at least in this part of the network, has a /32 or a 255, 255, 255, 255 net mask. So now we have some options. One of the options that we could do is go back to our code, right? And I could remove the need for this net mask since it's always going to be static, right? And I can define in the code the ability to just statically assign that and pass that on to the Cisco device that I'm making changes on. Could do that. Or the other option that we're talking about here is just statically defining it within the data transformation itself. So if we want to do that, we can. So we can remove this. And if I want to statically assign this to that, I just have to define a new string and then map it in. Again, this is totally dependent on these are options, right? This is totally dependent on how you want to deliver writing the code, what you want to manage, or what can be done here, and really who's managing it. This is something that the network engineering team is working on, doing these transformations and just passing data on to you. They can be in charge of defining these because this is part of perhaps their network policy that loopbacks have these, /32 net masks. Completely up to you, but these are your options. So save it, test it. This should be very straightforward. And now we're getting the right output. All right. So now we've got our data transformation almost done. It's very close. Let's go back to our workflow. So now let's include that transformation. So if I search through all of our API options here and features, I can bring in a JSON transformation. Let's tie it into the workflow. And now when I double click it, it's going to ask me some options here. First thing is the data transformation that it needs to reference. So this is what we've just created in the designer, DT2 demo transform. And it pops up in the search. Okay, now remember every task on this canvas is data in, data out, and everything is using a schema. So the incoming schema for this we've defined, right? Request IP address from netbox, if you recall. If we go back to this, that's exactly what we defined. So now it's asking us, well, where is that data coming from, right? So data in and data out. That comes from the previous task, request IP address. That's the API. That's the direct API call we use, and it's going to output a result value, which has all of that the JSON object that gets passed to it that we inferred the schema from. So that gives it its data out. So this data out, becomes the data in for this. It's going to do the transformation, and then it's going to output just the data that we need. So we can save this and run again. And this time we'll take a little visual view to see what's going on. Okay, so if I double click this, we can see the incoming data. This is what we statically assigned. So we're pulling an IP address from that same netbox prefix. The data out is, okay, it's given us the next one, but it's along with all of that other information that we have to parse through, which is the job of our transformation. So now the output of that API call becomes the input of this because we define the schema. And now what do we have coming out after the transformation? Exactly what we need to now pass on to our awesome program. So we've done that. So where have we been so far? Integration with a netbox system, the ability to have multiple versions of it as needed, building it on the fly on demand as we needed to, using API documentation, directly calling those APIs within a workflow, building the transformation to parse that data out in whatever format that's in. So really, what we're needing now is our code, right? So when we onboarded that in Automation Gateway and I attached that JSON schema, it created an API, gave us the definition for what we can pass to this now. So I can go to search for the name of it. So it's my create loopback code. And then we can attach it into the workflow. And I'll just shorten it here. Okay, so again, data in, data out. So what is the data coming in? This is defined. This is when we define when I defined the JSON schema. When I onboarded this, I showed you we created a schema that defines the values that matches up to the script itself, right? And so that gets communicated back into the Itential platform, and that's how we know these values. Now, 2 of these values come from our netbox source of truth. So we want to pass that data along to it through the transformation. So where does the data come from for this? It comes from our transformation, where we parsed out everything in the format we need. Same with netmask, comes from our transformation. And that's the outgoing. So those values were the outgoing schema of our transformation. So that's great, but we're missing 3 other values here. They have to come from somewhere, right? So that could be another source of truth. Could be coming from inventory, could be coming from ServiceNow, could be coming from a number of places. For simplicity, I'm just going to create a form or use a form, and we can input that in directly through a manual task to serve as another source of truth to provide that data. Now, again, this could be any number of things, and within the platform, kind of behind the scenes, like I said, everything is API centric, and JSON schema is how we and JSON objects is how we parse and validate data at every step of this. So even though I'm using a form within our platform, it would be no difference if we were accessing a database through an integration or an adapter, or looking up inventory in ServiceNow to populate some of that information for our script. So let's do that. So let's take a look at a form. And I've already have a form built here, so we're gonna leverage that. In our previous data transformation, I went through the elements of the form. We can just very quickly look at it here. Number 1, these are, again, drag and drop elements, so you can build your form out as you want. We have drop downs, checkboxes, text areas. I'll show you this. This is where we can select the router name. So that's the host field for our script. I'm defining the drop downs. This can actually be dynamically generated through another API call to pull data from from another system. But this is how we've built this out, so that we have a drop down to limit the options that the user can pull from. I've created a text input for the interface name. In this case, I've pre-populated it with a default value called loopback 301. And I've left a freeform text field called description. Those are the 3 data elements we're missing to pass to our script. So we're gonna generate them here. So that's the form. Oh, and One of the cool things here is, again, JSON, when we create the form, it's going to generate the JSON schema based off of how we create the form, and we can test it out. It's very similar to how we do the transformation in that canvas to be able to test it out. So this is the form that I've created. We have the dropdown, the default value here, and I can enter a description since it's a required field. And when I show form data, it's actually going to show me the JSON object that we've populated. And now we can use that as well, just like we did previously with the JSON response from this API call. Okay, so now let's use our form in this workflow. So here's the JSON form. We'll insert that into the workflow. Okay, we need the form ID. The form ID is the name of the form we're using. So this is DT2 demo. And then we need an object called instance data. And if I don't know what that is, this allows us to populate some default values for our JSON form. In this case, I don't want to populate any default values, kind of as an override. So I'm just going to give it an empty object and save that. Okay. So now we have our JSON form as another source of data, right? We have for 3 elements, we have 2 elements of the data we need are now going to be coming from the Netbox API call directly. And now we need to modify our transformation to now be able to use this so it can output that data in the right formats for our code. So let's go back to our designer. We've already shown how we can infer a schema here, and we've already shown we can have multiple outgoing schemas, but we can also have multiple incoming schemas as well from another source of data or source of truth. So if I click here, we can do the same process we did before. So this came from our form when I showed the form data, and it output the JSON from that test. So if I infer from here, it's going to create the schema based off of that and save the data as an example for our testing. I give it a unique name, save it, and now it's populated that data. Okay, so now we know that we need, for this, let's go back to our script, right? We need hosts, which is an array. We need an interface name, right? We need a description, and those 2 things are are strings. And so that comes from our form. So we know that the data source will come from the form, but now we need to go back to our designer, our JST designer here, and create the transformation for those 3 fields. So the outgoing schemas. So in this case, I'm going to create something called hosts, a variable called host. This is the array, so it's going to match our script. I'm also going to create interface name is a string. And then I'm going to create a description. Is also a string. Okay. Now let's take a look from our form data. The router name that we're inputting from our form is actually outputting as a string. It needs to be an array, so we have to do a little transformation on it, which is very simple, right? We can create a new array. The string becomes an element of the array, and it's only a single element. And now that meets the requirements here for the hosts. Interface name, again, is a string, and we can map that directly. No transformation or methods needed to change it into anything else. And let me double check that. Description, interface name. Okay, so that looks good. So the only transformation we needed was to turn this string into an array to meet the requirements for the script that we're running. And so if we save it, we can test it again, generate that, run it. And now this is the output from our tests. So we're going to get an IP address that matches, a net mask that matches. Here's the 3 new things that will be coming from our form, right? host array, interface name, and a description, both strings. And all that looks great. So that completes, we'll save this, that completes our transformation. Now let's go back to our workflow. And since we've updated our transformation, let's go back to this task that's using that transformation. I'm going to refresh it. Now it's populating the new input schema, incoming schema that we've defined from form data. And it's asking us, okay, where's this data coming from? And the output of our form, get form input, becomes the input for this. So that's where that data is coming from. That particular form outputs a variable called export, but that's going to hold the JSON object that we need to parse through for the transformation. Okay, so that's one piece. So now that'll do the transformation from two different sources, transform it, and output in a format that can now be used in our Python code. But now we have to tell the Python code, these are required fields as well, where that data is coming from. So again, the source of that data is going to be the output of our transformation task. So in this case, it's going to be hosts. The interface name is going to also come from there. And this is why kind of lining up the names becomes very important. So it makes it easy to identify. So we have our hosts mapped, our interface name mapped, our description mapped, our IP address, and our net mask. All right. So let's save that and let's give it a run. Okay. So let's do a visualize. Oh, actually, no, we're doing a form. So let's go back to this view. So because we're doing a form, that requires us to do a manual task. Again, if this was an API system or an IT system or some other source of truth that use an API, we could go directly and get the API. For simplicity, we're going to use a form. This is the form that I showed you earlier with the dropdown. We're going to keep loopback 301. We're going to enter a description. When I click confirm, that'll move the task along to the next part. So let's take a look at this. So now it's actually running, but let's take a look at the step by step. So we got our form. We're showed our form. We entered that manually. This is what it output as by way of the JSON object in a variable called export, right? The next step in this workflow was to also pull data from Netbox in order to get the next available IP, right? So we did that earlier. Filled that out, and now we got the next available IP, which is 10.4.1.4. Of course, now we need to use our transformation, our data transformation, our JSON schema transformation here, and we're pulling data, the output of the Netbox call, right? That was one of the incoming schemas, and the data from the form. So both of those data sources are coming into our transformation, and we're going through all those steps of transformation to output precisely what we need for our Python script. That is IP address, net mask, the host that we're going to operate on, and the interface and description. That then gets passed over as the output of that transformation becomes the input here into our script. This is now API accessible because of the JSON schema that we created for it in Automation Gateway. So now we can pass these variables in. They're validated, and then when the script runs, we have a success here showing us that it made the change. So if we hop over to Netbox, we can see our path of IP addresses, the last one being, let's see, 10.4.1.4, right? And if I go over here to Configuration Manager, so this is, I can access these network devices directly. This is the device we made the change on. Remember, if it's loopback 301, we'll load the current config. Here we go. Interface loopback 301, hello webinar world was the description, and the IP address is the one we pulled from Netbox. So that data came from two sources. So let's recap. Earlier, I said that one of the things that's very difficult to manage over time, it almost has a snowball effect, is integrations and data transformation. So as you're writing code, the more integrations you have into that code, the more data transformation you're going to have to do in that code. And as those systems change versions or the entire IT ecosystem changes in some way, people move from netbox to infoblox, or infoblox to netbox, or some sort of merger happens, and now you have an entire group of new IT systems that have to be leveraged in automation. And any of these things that happen, that occur in the IT ecosystem, can mean we have to update our code to and manage all of the integrations and the data transformations. With Itential, hopefully you've been able to see how we can quickly enable you to integrate into any system, right? So you don't have to rely on plugins or even roll, modules, libraries, packages, or even rolling your own REST API code for integration. We can make it very simple and easy to run multiple versions of, or an entire ecosystem of versions across all of your devices and all of your systems, so that you can leverage those in your automations. These transformations are reusable components. So once they're created, these transformations can be used in multiple workflows that now call your code. And now your code can potentially be streamlined to just accept, be passed the data exactly as you need it from the source, from the right sources, transformed into the data as you need it. And then you can focus on writing awesome code to do whatever the project needs to be done. Now, these give you options. Hopefully, we've been able to show you that that from a DevOps perspective, transformations along with bringing your own code and integrations is something that may be worthy of looking at, especially if this is deployed in your environment and your networking teams are already leveraging them to build their own automations. This could be something very, very relevant and could save you a lot of time. In addition to this, and we won't cover it here, but you could also create a child workflow. So imagine a standalone workflow that includes that's focus is to just request an IP address. And within that workflow, think of it as a subroutine or a function or a method that can be called from other workflows. And now you can kind of generalize it, maybe not in a complete abstraction, but you can generalize it. And the logic of that workflow becomes the main process by which automations use to request an IP address, so that if things change on the back end between systems or data, the way it's represented, you can change that. Everybody's calling the same workflows, which are calling the same, adapter calls, API calls, and using the same transformation. And perhaps it makes it much easier for you to manage those types of changes. The other things that are available here are the ability to clone workflows and test things on the fly, so that if you do have to do a cutover to a new version, you can already have those things already enabled in the system, integrated, and already tested out. So this gives you a lot of opportunity to start thinking through some of these features and functionalities as a DevOps team member, and seeing how this can help make your job a little bit easier, or maybe a lot easier, right? So that you can focus on writing amazing and awesome code. So with that, we'll end the webinar and the demo. Hopefully you found this useful, and please reach out to us if you have any questions. We're more than happy to engage with you. And until next time, we'll talk to you soon.